In my experience, most of the time people see contracts as fitting into one of two buckets. Either they're good for nothing because they're going to put them in their drawer and they never expect to look at them at all.
Right.
And therefore they see everything that the lawyer is doing to negotiate the contract as a waste of time. And then there's the other person who also might put the contract in the drawer, but assumes it's going to take care of everything or any problem that could ever come up.
Right.
And the analogy that I like to use to people is, a contract's really not Dumbo's feather. It's not if you just grab a hold of it, it's going to enable you to fly. You're either going to be executing that on your own or you're not, and you're going to be failing on your own. And the contract really is not determinative of either one of those things coming true.
Right. And if I remember from earlier conversations, so you spent a long time as an in-house counsel doing the construction contract piece for your employer, so to speak, and kind of you would get both sides of those at the same time.
That's right. That's right. So I would be working with multiple people on the project team, both negotiating our contract with an owner
Right.
and negotiating contracts with subcontractors. And you'd find both of those views within the project team. It was fairly interesting, a nice push-pull.
Right. And so as you move away from the Dumbo feather, world, what are the primary purposes that you would ascribe to a construction contract? What does somebody need to go into it looking to get?
Well, usually the way I explain this to people is that there's two purposes that this contract's going to achieve. And so for like the project construction manager, certainly they need to understand that their ability to execute the work, and this is true from the owner's perspective as well.
Right.
The more clear the scope is, how the project gets priced, how the schedule's worked out, the more successful everybody's going to be in actually executing the project and getting the work done.
Sure.
It's an important value of the contract.
Sure.
And the other one that's lurking, sort of the gorilla in the background, so to speak, is its balance sheet protection. So you really want to make sure you understand what's going to happen if fill in the blank. I'll give you an example. Sun Prairie recently had, within this last week,
Right.
a major explosion that
Right.
occurred.
Right.
And that was something that resulted during construction. When something like that happens and there are multiple buildings that are damaged or gone,
Someone
you really
or
want
some entity can be in ruin.
That's right. You can lose your business if you don't understand how your contract's going to handle that loss.
Sobering. So as we think about, and maybe let's just take those two pieces as kind of our launching point. So let's assume that, someone who isn't a construction professional, or perhaps maybe the first construction contract ever drafted is your assignment, and we don't have the precedent and the awareness of all that can go wrong and the concern about balance sheet protection. We're just trying to get this building on the road. Give me a taxonomy of the different components that you would see going into the get it done part of the contract.
Sure. And these are the things that everybody's going to spot, but maybe not with the level of granularity that they should.
Right.
So you're certainly going to have scope, right? I want to know what is it that I'm getting at the end of this project. And what becomes either easy or complicated is how detailed you need to be in that scope. The more complex the project is, the more different types of documents you're going to have. So you have multiple documents, spec, drawings, design drawings, engineering drawings. They're all going to be overlapping the same piece, physical piece of the work. And you either need to make sure that those things are fully aligned, or that there's an order of priority between those documents so that hey, if I called for it here but I didn't call for it there, I still get
Right.
X, Y, or Z.
Right. So plans are giving you the kind of the layout. The spec is giving you the quality, so to speak, or exactly what you are. And the scope is essentially a matrix saying who's doing what. And so you're usually right. You have inclusions and exclusions. And so people want to spell out in as excruciating a detail as possible, exactly what they're not going to do as much as what they are going to do, so that they're not left holding the baton for something that they didn't price.
Right. Exactly.
Question.
So that's
Go ahead.
that's scope, and we can get into more detail about what can go right and wrong about scope. One thing that maybe we park for now, but you often are describing what conditions you expect in your scope.
That's right.
Hey, I don't expect there to be a cave underneath this site, and if there is, then the foundation plan is going to be completely different, something like this.
Which is, in a sense, going ahead and bringing in that balance sheet protection component even into the spec itself, because even in telling you what I'm going to do, I'm making certain extraordinary assumptions that there's not a World War II bunker under this. And
Exactly right.
I see.
And depending on where you live in this country, that's a very real issue. If you live in oil country, there are guaranteed to be abandoned pipes around where you're at. If you're in coal country, guaranteed to be abandoned mines in those areas. So this is a pretty important thing, and there's a number of things you can do to protect yourself from that.
Some friends and I have the ill-fated plan to make a bunch of scope documents for all the different trades, and I have tried to incorporate into some of the contracts that we've written essentially form matrices, owner responsibility, and you just kind of go through and check. The dilemma with doing that in the final construction, it's one thing to do it in an RFP to get the conversation going, but then to say, okay, up to the very last thing, I have this autofill form.
Yeah.
Some of it is because of overlap. Sometimes the plumber does this. Sometimes the plumber has to dig some trench. Sometimes it's the excavator, and so it's difficult to outline all of the potential scope gaps, which that also seems to be one of the biggest challenges with the scope, right? Like, what if it's not assigned to anybody, but have you had the experience that it's possible to standardize scope documents to any degree, or is that an entirely fruitless pursuit?
What I've seen are owners that do that. So these are owners that have rather large campuses, and they are trying to standardize the systems and the materials.
Institutional level people who are building another hospital or another university dorm or something.
Yes. And so those sort of exercises seem to work pretty well, because over time, you know exactly the kind of building and the type of materials you want and where people typically fall down. And your contractors and other partners get to understand what it is that you mean. It isn't a situation where standardization makes communication between new people just go away. Like, oh, I just read the spec and the drawings and it's completely clear. Unless you want to spend a ton on your architect and engineer, and even then it's not likely to happen. It usually happens when you have an ongoing relationship that's repetitive enough, both in the type of buildings and the type or the specific people you're using, where that standardization really starts to pay dividends.
At the risk of lingering on this when we have a lot to talk about, another tension that I have with scope and spec documents, given how voluminous they can be, as you're saying, is that it's kind of like in a contract in general. To the extent that you take more and more words to describe what you mean, in some sense you could say you're making it more conspicuous, you're making it harder to misunderstand. In other senses, though, you're like you're almost opening more opportunities for misunderstanding. And specifically, the phenomenon that you just described, no one wants to read the whole spec. I've seen spec book, like all the submittals, like we're dealing with mere mortals here. I've been on these construction sites and I know these people who do these things. And is that just a necessary evil that you're going to have a absolute monster of a document which is not going to lend itself to reading, but that's what has to happen?
I think where it pays dividends, I mean, there's this dynamic of should I leave it open-ended, or if I spell it out, am I somehow boxing myself in from being able to argue with people later? And I've always sort of favored if you know what you want, say it. You should be able to say it clearly without being too verbose, but let's get it out there. Where it seems to pay dividends are with the people who are purchasing. So, I mean, narration, yes, that can get overly complicated. But if you're a contractor that needs to go through a purchasing or estimating exercise, and there's a great deal of specificity with regard to what they need to do, then that thicker tome of specs and drawings can help, because the person's not guessing, well, any old X or Y or equivalent will work. It's that thing, and you get a more detailed itemization, especially if you're doing some sort of cost verification on the back end. I guess my point is, think about how you expect this tome to be used. If it's merely a Dumbo's feather, right? If anything goes wrong, it was in there, and I can say it was in there. Yep. If it's a support for an estimating and scheduling and purchasing function, and you're working with your contractor or with your owner to make sure that those things serve a value, it could actually be of great use.
Which in some sense argues against the practice of having this standard document that you just say download from the website. There it is, in its platonic ideal form. It kind of forces you to go back each time. Last question before we move on to price. When we talk about the drawings, obviously the contractor is going to take the drawings and the specs and the scope, and they're going to use that to give you a price. As people who will know who've watched the show, you have schematic design, design development, and construction documents, the 3 levels of resolution of architectural plans. Do you as a lawyer chat with the architect to say, my understanding is this is an almost impossible line to draw, because the plans are always still getting finished. Has there ever really been a set of perfectly finished plans? Do you attempt to establish, or what is the nature of the go ahead that everyone gets? Okay, these are the plans. Like, is there some moment of finality when one says, okay, now we're ready to actually do this. Now we're ready to pull the trigger because the drawings are to such a stage? Is there a benchmark for how to know when you're at that point?
Usually it's where somebody's willing to take the risk of price, right? So if you're, and I guess also the equivalent risk of quality. So if you're a contractor and you're ready to go to a fixed, guaranteed lump sum price on maybe very robust DD, design development level, or very light CD, construction document level drawings, because let's say you understand the building type so well that you can say, yep, I'm ready to lock it in. Especially in an environment like today where you're seeing a lot of inflation, that can be a good thing. And back to our spec discussion, if I, the contractor, know that you, the owner, want X, kind of brand or whatever it is, I can actually start my pre-ordering process, lock in commitments, and do a lot of stuff. So that would be the answer I'd have. There's no perfect answer to it. Obviously,
so it's a risk profile decision.
Yes.
All right. Well, then that brings us then to chatting about price, and so I have to imagine. I'm on some of these emails where it's like, you get the email back from the contractor, and they're like, "I've attached the price."
Right.
I should say, "I've attached, the essence of the of our bid," and it's like 20 pages. Might as well just put those single. Like everyone just wants to go straight for that number, but of course that's difficult because there's different. Again, there's different ways that you can structure the relationship between the owner and the contractor vis-a-vis the pricing and how it will change when conditions change. So walk us through the different primary configurations that you encounter and or recommend when negotiating a price for this monster of a building.
Yeah, and some of this stuff, as you say, is a risk profile, but it's an informed risk decision. So if you're in an environment where you have a lot of material prices escalating, it might make sense to say, okay, I'm going to agree. Maybe I'm going to feel like I'm paying a little bit too much, but I'm going to lock in a fixed amount. I'm comfortable with the drawings, the spec, and I'll sign on the dotted line for $20 million today, but that's it. And of course, there's always caveats to this, so keep that in the back of your head. That's one way of pricing risk. Another way of pricing risk is, well, I don't really believe you. I believe you, if I'm the owner, you, the contractor, are too concerned about price escalation. I actually think this is going to cost less. So I'm going to do something like cost plus. Whatever it is that you spend, give me
Add
the
overhead.
Yep. We agree on what the overhead is. We agree on what kind of markup you get on your labor. We agree on what kind of markup you get on your rented equipment that you're supplying to the job. You can get into a lot of granularity about how cost is defined, but ultimately the structure is cost plus profit.
Okay. So you'd take a GMP for the same reason that you would take a certain side of an interest rate swap. You are assuming that the other party, it may be miscalculating, either over or underestimating the price volatility.
Right. Or, let's not forget the political side of this. Sometimes people just like to not commit. And so therefore, or they don't want the risk of, politically, they don't want the risk. So if you're an owner and you're phobic about overruns, right? I just cannot have a situation where my budget gets blown. I'll pay to have that
There's
risk
a premium.
removed.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of an insurance policy locked in.
Exactly.
Well, I know before we move on to schedule, which I know is a thing which has a huge influence potentially on price, I remember the first major construction project that I was involved in somewhat on the sidelines. We had a gross maximum price or guaranteed maximum price in theory, but in the contract, there were plenty of allowances. For our viewers' background on allowances, where you say, we haven't picked out every single last thing, and or perhaps we haven't drawn exactly how it's going to be.
Right.
But we are blocking off or setting aside a certain block of cash in the budget. Maybe it's for furniture, FF&E. Shoot, we haven't picked out the pool furniture yet, but let's just pencil in $100,000 for all the furniture in the first floor or something, and the computers and copiers, whatever. What we ran into was not that the guaranteed maximum price was necessarily the issue, but rather the allowances were, it seemed, being used as a way to circumvent what seemed to be a guaranteed maximum price, but in fact had a ton of play, because these allowances, and perhaps it's because they were allowances for things for which really you shouldn't have just done an allowance. You should have had more detail and just gone on, and maybe that was it. But have you had that experience, whether it's with allowances and change orders we'll talk about a bit later, but has that been because I know you've done a lot of medical stuff, which I know, one extra MRI, whoops, that's $3.5 million. Have you run into issues where allowances have been used to greatly exceed what looked like a guaranteed maximum price?
Yes. So allowances can be they can be a solution to two different problems, right? One, they're a solution to a design that isn't quite done, and I think that's often a poor solution. There's like the adage, draw twice, build once sort of thing.
Yep.
And that's where your architectural dollars are well spent. Get that allowance to go away or to be much smaller. And the other side of it is a substitute for owner decisions. And that's also a bad solution as well.
Right.
Because
Don't
it just
give
kicks
someone else that decision. Make it yourself.
Right. So kicking it down the can doesn't really help you either. I mean, an allowance isn't another Dumbo's feather. It's a guess
Right.
based on it could be solid information. So your allowance could be well drafted, saying these are the parameters that we think we're assuming here, and therefore your contractor can do a much better job at estimating that. Or it could just be a placeholder for, I know I want something, an MRI or whatever, some type of thing, but I have no parameters around it, so it could be a tiny number or a huge number. I mean, these are all, in my opinion, decisions that could have been made earlier, but for some particular reason, people want to not have that pain now.
Okay, so it's the sin of omission on the part of the owner for having not done the work to nail those things down, which you would say in most cases they have left themselves open to an allowance being used that way and or just turning out that way because
Yeah.
there were decisions that they chose not to make for whatever reason. Okay. Hold on
Your
one second.
point was, hey, will a contractor use this against me as sort of the loophole for charging me more than what I anticipated? And certainly, I mean, that's always going to be the case. It's not just allowances; it's any poorly defined element of the job. So allowances are just an easy way for somebody to explain to an owner, well, I didn't know what you wanted here. You told me what you wanted, and it cost 3 times as much, so it costs 3 times as much. I mean, that certainly can occur, but it can occur through a detail and a plan. Well, the plan didn't tell me I had to actually put a door on the door frame. Now that you told me that, I got to do that. So that comes down to vetting your contractor in the first place, as opposed to, I think, doing something contractually that would have made that problem go away.
I'm just thinking of the solidarity that contractors, architects, and lawyers have in not knowing exactly what the owner wants and then being asked to draft something, to encapsulate it. So let's transition from price to schedule using a debate which is had very often, and I have asked people on the GC side this question. In the academy, there's the idea that this business of having allowances that aren't, that are used as opposed to making better decisions, and change orders and conflicts that came up and schedule delays which increase the price could all be avoided if the decision and investment was made to work an extra month on the plans or work an extra 6 weeks on the plans. The idea being that you'd have plans which are at a higher resolution so that you wouldn't need these allowances. There wouldn't be the HVAC duct that hit the gas line. There wouldn't be these things. And that's what I was taught. Every contractor I've spoken to says, people are like a gas that fills, effort is like a gas that fills the space it has, and you're going to get a relatively similar level of blend of perfection and error, almost regardless of how long you take, because the person who's drawing this thing is going to say, oh, I have an extra 6 weeks. Now I can work on the other account. What's your anecdotal experience as somebody on the construction law side in that debate?
Yeah, I think both of those are true, and they're not just true of construction projects, right? So you have in any project that you're working on, the level and skill of project management really dictates how well or poorly this specific issue occurs. So if you have sort of lax project management, yeah, procrastination is going to push everything up to the last minute, regardless of what the last minute is. If it's today, it's today. If it's 6 months from now, it's 6 months from now. You get the same result. If you have, and this is difficult to get, and this is what I mean about vetting your partners, and that can be hard to do, but well worth the value. If you have good, solid project management and somebody who is willing to have those candid conversations with the owner, hey, and that's hard, right? To tell an owner, if you're not going to make this decision, then here is the consequence you're likely to expect, can be perceived from a project management side as telling the owner they're foolish or they're not being a good owner, and people are reluctant to have those
Right.
candid conversations. But those are the people that you want in your team who are going to tell you the real consequence of what's going to happen here.
I hear you telling me that even the best contract can't fix dysfunctional leadership, and I just don't know. I don't know what to think about that, Eli. I can say as a profession, developers are hoping that such a contract exists. So
Right.
let's talk about the schedule then.
I wish it existed too.
That's right. That's right. So we've got our scope that we're comfortable with, and we've got a price, and now obviously the price for everyone's background. I guess I thought when I started in development that the construction price and the project price were one and the same thing. You just get from the contractor what this costs, and that's your development budget. Of course, the building is the largest portion of the development budget, but it's maybe
Right.
70% of it. There's a lot of other things, and many of those other things, including and certainly not least of them, the financing costs, and your interest and carry and all that stuff, are extremely sensitive to the schedule and how long this takes, and even more so as the project gets bigger and bigger. The
Right.
extra month of interest on 200 million. So let's talk about schedule and how contracts attempt to nail down a construction schedule, which is something that is very famous and notoriously hard to nail down, right? I mean, walk us through how you approach that.
Right. And I think that this kind of gets to at least part of the reason why people perhaps start earlier than they should with projects is there's this anxiety and desire to get things moving, both from a cost perspective and also from, especially if you're a developer, a keeping everybody glued to the deal perspective. And that can, when you see those things as a lawyer at the beginning of a project where you see things being forced, that's when you as either the owner or the contractor or the lawyer should be thinking, I can see the dispute coming, because a lack of effective coordination and communication is inevitably going to create some problem along the road. In terms of schedule, it's a bit like the design, right? A well-developed design will allow for a well-developed schedule, and you do things. There are two typical directions that you bracket this with. One is, and this is the push-pull between owners and contractors. Hey, if Hurricane Katrina occurs, I'm not going to be able to get done on time, just so you know. This is like the bucket of force majeure.
100-year flood, yeah.
Right. Acts of God sort of thing. And then on the other side, you have the owner saying, well, if you don't get done on time, and it wasn't because of force majeure stuff, I have these liquidated damages in here that are going to approximate, as you're talking about, things like construction interest and other things that I'm having to incur as a result of you being late. And it effectively allows people to quantify, hey, should I throw overtime labor on this job, or is it better just to pay the liquidated damages? So
I see. Cost benefit, when you're a month out and you're going to be a week late, should you pay people over, work Saturday, Sunday, or should you just... Now, as a part of these liquidated damages, just so people have a concept of this, liquidated damages, that's sounds like a punk rock band.
Yeah.
I mean, that includes things like, well, our tenants were planning to move in and now they have to get hotels for a week, this kind of thing, which really adds up quickly, obviously. Yeah, and I have also often been told that, weather and labor, the availability of labor that you have to subcontract are the two biggest construction risks, and it's very difficult to, obviously, it's impossible to rein in the first one and very difficult to rein in the second.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things that people do. So one thing regarding rain is prefabrication of certain components. So if you can put it in the dry, so to speak, faster, and isolate yourself from that kind of risk, that's good. And if you can do that by prefabricating in a controlled environment, great. Another thing that owners can do to protect themselves is say, okay, there are key milestones that you must be hitting in order for this job to be done on time. And if you miss any of those milestones,
Yep.
that results in a default in the contract and allows me, the owner, to require you, the contractor, to do certain things.
So you don't have to wait until the very end to take action and say, wait a minute, this is out of control.
Right, exactly. So just like with pricing, there are bookends of this and then a whole bunch of choices between the two that you can use depending on, what the particular risks are to your job.
Mm-hmm. So for our viewers, a Gantt chart is a chart that shows different activities as they relate to one another, and specifically if there's something that can't start before another thing ends or begin before the other, whatever. That's a Gantt chart. Do most construction contracts have an official attached Gantt with days?
As a lawyer working for a contractor, I would discourage it. So, and
I mean, if you're on the owner's side, for example.
if you're on the owner's side, yeah, that would be great. But I mean, at some point, you're asking for inevitable problems. What you want to do is allow the contractor to choose means and methods to get stuff done. If you start taking ownership of that as the owner and saying, I require you to do it in this order.
Now you're kind of getting out of your business line and into theirs.
Right. And you're basically taking on or taking off of the contractor a certain amount of risk for how to orchestrate the work by saying, well, contractor, just like with specs, they're like, well, they drew it this way, they spec'd it this way, I did it the way it was drawn. If it doesn't work, that's not my fault. If I built it the way that you, in the order you want it to be built, and that creates some kind of unintended consequence, that's on you.
Right. I have heard that in chatting with, I was recently trying to get a civil engineer to export a 3D rendering of a grading plan. I could pull it into SketchUp or something and see just exactly what is this, because I have a hard time reading those two-dimensional with the tick marks, and how am I supposed to know what this means? And I was chatting with them about that, and that very issue came up. Like, if you attempt to referee on this grading plan, which sometimes at the end of a project, when you see how something drains, you're like, I wish I had done that. But they said, get a better civil engineer. Like, if you start doing that, now there's this idea that you signed off on it and had some awareness of it, which maybe you should try to claim that you didn't, because then what's your recourse to their insurance that they need to cover it, their professional liability insurance, because you saw it and at least claimed to have understood it and signed off on it in a way that was unnecessary.
Right. And the way that some people deal with that is through this idea of performance specifications and just saying, look, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job. It just needs to do X at the bottom of it.
I know Seinfeld has this line about, you get on the plane and they say, we're going to go up to 30,000 feet and we're going to turn left at Baltimore. And he's like, just get where the ticket says at approximately that time. I don't really need to know. We're eating the peanuts back here.
Right.
Last question on schedule. Have you experienced situations where, because of critical path issues, because of weather, and when you hit winter, there's winter conditions that have to be paid for in the contract, heat the building and so on. Have you experienced situations where the delays of drawings and of legal negotiations led people to say, hey, let's revisit this in 9 months? Like, really, we wanted to start 3 months ago. Let's just push it out a year. Does that happen?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. I mean, surely it happens that people don't start on time, and all of a sudden you're in.
I should say, like, let's say that the perfect time to start building a hotel is September, so that you hit the spring market or something. Who knows? Every asset class has its own times when it's best to finish. Let's say that you've missed that now by 3 or 4 months, and if you now start, you're going to do the equivalent of opening up an apartment building in December.
Yep.
Or January. How often do you see people then say, now that we've gotten all of our ducks in a row, let's delay for 5 months because the timing will be devastating if we start now? Do you see that?
I see that push-pull. Usually people are fairly reluctant to push it out 6 months, a year.
Because then
And
your
if
pricing is probably going to go up.
Oh yeah, your pricing, your ability to hit a market. I mean, these are both like retail markets, but also consumer markets. So like in healthcare, you're fighting to keep a competitor out of your market space, and that could be true of any
Of
kind of
course,
industry.
yeah. You're onto a trend. You're trying to capitalize on a trend which may evaporate if other people capture all the potential tenants.
Or you're just communicating the wrong thing. So in other words, what people will do is they'll say, look, I am claiming dibs to this market. You can see I have a foundation in here. Maybe I have some of the steel up, but then they'll drag out other pieces of the construction to hit the market as they want when they open, but they'll still be communicating to their competitors, we are building here. You can drive by the site and see.
I see. So that's a way to...
I mean, that's why people just clear sites, right? And then nothing happens, but there's a big fence around it. Yeah.
I see. So that's a certain
happening.
kind of a market share play. Excellent. That's really interesting.
Yep.
All right. So we've got this thing. We got the scope. We know what everybody's supposed to be doing and the price and when they're supposed to have done it. And we were kind of taking that on the metaphor that what if this was the first construction contract ever and we didn't know what could go wrong. So let's talk now, with, the better part of, 5 to 10 millennia of construction behind us. What can go wrong? I'll flash a picture of some given building site, but kind of walk me through a taxonomy now of the different kinds of things which can go wrong for which we need to have certain legal mechanisms to protect us.
Yeah. So we've talked about things that can go wrong on the project execution side. Why am I not getting my price or the scope or the schedule that I want? Other things apart from that could go wrong with a project really relate to a couple different buckets, probably 3. One is property damage, and that can be property damage to the owner's stuff, property damage to somebody else's stuff. You also have bodily injury. Again, that could be bodily injury to the contractor or subcontractor's employees or somebody else. And then you have this sort of loose other bucket of stuff, which is probably best called design defect, but it could be construction/design defect where the thing isn't working as it should. And that could either merely be like a functional problem, or it could be leading to the property damage and the bodily injury. So those are some of the big buckets, and we can talk about like some examples within that if that helps.
Right. So let's start with the property then. So I know we chatted about, in some sense, you just kind of start from the ground up. So I mean, walk me through some of those things that can happen with the property or the building.
Yeah. So with the site, I mean, that's you have a certain amount of dirt, and you want to kind of understand how that dirt's going to perform. So usually you get a geotechnical engineer that comes in and says, this is what I think the site will support per square foot.
Right.
And here's my recommendation on the foundation system that goes in there.
Right.
This is one of those risk areas where you ought to be listening pretty hard. Because if the geotech is giving you a lot of caveats about their report, maybe you ought to spend another $1,000 and get a few more borings done to figure out what's going on with that site.
That's not the way to save money.
No.
As very famously currently in litigation, I think the Millennium Tower in San Francisco, which is leaning, do you know this story? I'm trying to get a geotech from San Francisco to talk with me about that very project. No takers yet, unsurprisingly. But and as our viewers may not know, you have a building, it's a luxury condominium tower in San Francisco that's leaning, I think, 16 inches. I can't remember how much it is, but it's sunk in, a substantial amount. And it's not just that it's sinking this way, but it's kind of, Tower of Pisa style leaning. So, okay, so the site and the geotech, that's a huge potential area of risk with the dirt and the foundation. Okay, so sorry, I interrupted.
So that's site, and that also obviously impacts the foundation design that you're choosing. The cost of repairing things like this are disproportionately astronomical compared to spending money on the geotechnical report, and I never grasped why people wanted to save money at this point. It just, I mean, unless you have like a slab on grade of a pretty simple building, it's
Well,
it's not
I know
worth
that
it.
geotech often comes relatively early in pre-development, or it can. It's kind of a debate, but it's one of those things you got to pay with in cash way before you know.
Yeah,
And so I think that's one of the tensions. Like, if we don't move forward with this, I just wasted 30 grand. You know, like.
yeah. Well,
But
I'll give you one worse.
please.
So they'll get this geotech early, or sorry, the site work done early,
Right.
and this and just geotechnical engineers report done, and then the building will move slightly, and people will say, well, geez, do we need to get a new geotechnical report or not? Surely,
Because we moved the footprint of the building 6 feet.
yep, surely it's the same over there. Let me tell you, it's not probably the best move. It may, in fact, be exactly the same dirt 6 feet over. But if 6 feet over, that's where they happen to encounter the void or something underneath the building.
Then you've got a massive legal question mark. Well, not even a question mark, just like, we didn't write our report about that footprint. We wrote it about this one.
That's exactly what the geotechnical engineer is going to say. So that's just a little point about how things get done early, and they need to kind of get wrapped up and cleaned up at the end to make sure that your report matches your actual footprint.
Okay. So the dirt, presumably then with the property, you get the different things. I mean, just building windows don't fit, column ceilings too short. I mean, let's get into all that stuff.
Yeah, so these are like things that damage the building, right? So these are things that could really impact your balance sheet, either as a contractor or as an owner, depending on how the contract allocates that risk. So if you have a leaning building or a sinking building or a building where the foundation is cracking, the slab is cracking, those are all very expensive and disruptive to your business and expensive to fix. The other area where you have a lot of problems that relate to property damage to the building itself is in the building envelope, right? It's not sealed up right, it's leaking from somewhere.
Right.
And that's inclusive of the roof. So those are the areas where when you talk about, geez, how much time should we spend really detailing stuff at the front end, and won't everything really get done right at the very end? Well, I would advocate pay most attention to those areas that are most likely to be generating large pieces of property damage. Nail those down. Don't do allowances for those, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And let the things that are less impactful to your balance sheet or your operations perhaps float a little bit more.
Well, and to some extent, it seems related to the difficulty of changing, and if you get it wrong the first time, because these are the wrong faucets, or I wanted the door to swing the other way, as opposed to the flashing inside the enclosed walls is malfunctioning.
Right.
And
Hard
water
to fix.
isn't weeping out of the building correctly.
Yeah.
What
Weeping
is
into the
going to be
building.
required to fix that? Okay, point taken. So that's the building and the roof. Obviously, you said third party. This is like, there were 10 cars and they were painting and spray paint went all over everybody's car, or
Yeah, I'm thinking about this more from the standpoint of either buildings that are, well, one, you're a tenant in somebody else doing a build out in somebody else's building. So you have adjacent property that you don't own and control.
I see.
That you can be damaging.
Right.
And if you take that far enough, I mean, certainly there is other people's personal property like cars and things like that. But the more significant damage is that done to adjoining property.
I see. So you're digging way down, and in doing so, you take tension off of the things that are holding up their foundation walls or something, and now they've got,
Right.
like, as you dig down, you make this bathtub. If it's not well reinforced, like suddenly their building starts sliding into your hole, or
Yeah, Milwaukee had an interesting version of this where they had basically wood pylons that served as foundation. And when an adjoining property owner drained an area to build their building, essentially exposing the wood, which was covered in water based on the water table, to air, and then that rotted, and then this adjoining building suddenly had foundation problems as a result of the dewatering on the adjoining property site. I mean, these are, hard things to predict, but
That's a pretty scary example, Eli. I mean,
yeah,
how are you supposed to know that you can't dewater on your site? Because it goes back to geotech is so scary. I mean, stuff in the dirt.
yeah.
Okay, so that's third party damage. Um, Scary. And then bodily injury. I mean, this is kind of we're building a stadium and somebody falls off and dies, and now we're stopping for a year to do a study of what went wrong, kind of thing.
Right. So this is injury to the worker or injury to a third party. And in that case, I mean, obviously they're equivalent in the harm to the individual, but whether they're workers' comp or third party injury, they get treated dramatically different from a legal perspective and how payments get made.
Do injuries, as you say, when do injuries, let me put the caveat on this that I'm not asking this question as some industrial capitalist, I'm just asking the question. When do injuries cause a building project to stop?
Usually they're going to cause a project to stop when you have to have, as you're pointing out, a fairly extensive investigation. So in other words, you have to say, okay, whatever it was that's going on here, OSHA has got to come in and inspect. Maybe other forensic experts want to come in and inspect because they know there's going to be a fairly large dispute about why the injury occurred, who's responsible for it, and you need to sort of cordon off the area to figure that out. I mean, that would be true for bodily injury. And after that's done, nothing immediately is coming to mind as to why it would slow up a project.
I see. And then we chatted about construction defects and design defects. That just has to do with the steel. I've heard of situations where you pour the concrete, you have to test the concrete in certain intervals. It doesn't turn out to have been strong enough. Now you have to bust it up, or you have to wait for 2 weeks to see if it's cured better. The steel from China was fabricated, something. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, going back to the property damage, like the building envelope.
Yep.
I mean, that would be a very common situation where it could be the fault of construction, it wasn't built right, or it could be the fault of design, it wasn't designed right.
Okay, yeah.
And you have this mixture. And the reason I point that out is that can be a very confusing dispute to work through. And depending on how you went to contract, that can be an easier thing to work through or a harder thing to work through. Harder from everybody's perspective. And as an owner, all you want to do is just get your building up and operating. So if you can make the dispute be shorter, that's better.
Right. Said all developers everywhere. So we're thinking through these things, and it's really a voluminous, and we've chatted about this. So you can have other issues in terms of project execution. So I alluded to one earlier. Nobody thought this was their job. I was in a building where 250 units, and no one had caulked any of the tubs because it was like, we're opening next week, and somebody should probably caulk all 250 of these tubs. Who wants to do that?
Right.
There's scope misalignment, and we discussed earlier differing site conditions where I didn't realize, that the site was as it is. Delays, I suppose, are kind of encapsulated in what we chatted about with the schedule. So we also chatted about you have a business of making buildings, but other people also have a business and they're a part of this. So what happens if a subcontractor or your GC, even worse, have business problems related to some other project and they can't continue? I mean, who are you suing at this point? You're suing this non-existent or at least bankrupt entity. What do you do?
Yeah, and that's certainly a real problem as you see consolidation within the construction industry. I mean, a subcontractor or contractor that's struggling, all of a sudden they're struggling on all their projects. And it can, one job can cripple the ability of all the other jobs to occur. So there's there's multiple things you can do. One thing you can do, apart from just picking a good contractor, and you see this vetted through different ways, like tell me how many jobs you got going on,
Sure.
blah, 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 blah. You can ask about material procurement. Hopefully that won't continue.
Speaking
not
of
sure.
adjacent property, is that,
Yeah, exactly.
Does your wife have a construction project, or is that next
Yeah,
door?
we have a little construction project going on here.
I love the transom, by the way. How fitting that in a episode about construction and
There is
everything that can
construction
happen-
noise in the background.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Well, material is often an area where the ability to procure it and get it on site is an issue. So it's both a default risk, right? Sub can't get it, so they can't do their work, and it's a scheduling risk. Hey, they can't get it there on time, and therefore your project is suddenly pushed 6 months out. So you can affect that as an owner or as a contractor managing subcontractors by procuring that stuff yourself.
right.
This roots all the way back into the conversation we had about how detailed should the specs be. If you know exactly what it is that you have to order and procure, the owner can do that, the general contractor can do that, others can do that, and you can isolate yourself from risk. It's much easier, still difficult, but it's easier to find labor to install than obtain material that has suddenly become unavailable because of some natural disaster in Puerto Rico or something like that.
Right.
So that's just a project management thing. On the legal side, the other thing you can do is obtain payment and performance bonds, and those are related to, they're actually two separate bonds, a payment bond and a performance bond.
Yep.
And one is guaranteeing that the contractor or the subcontractor are going to pay their downstream people. And if they're not, you got to claim against the bond.
Yep.
And the performance is the other side of that. They're getting their work done. If they're not, surety comes in and performs the work that they weren't doing.
So upon hearing all these things that can go wrong, delays and people getting hurt and not having drywall and stuff, I have to imagine that some people come to you and just say, Eli, I want this thing to be as buttoned down as possible. You make it as long as you want it to be. I just want to be protected. I value your services. So you just send me the billing, but make this as robust and risk-free a contract as possible. Is that counsel or is that a request that you enjoy hearing, or let's talk about, so now that we have these issues, what are we going to do about them?
Yeah. And I've seen it on both sides of the equation. I've seen it on the owner side saying, we're going to have the most iron tight, bulletproof contract. And I've seen it on the contractor side. And both create problems getting to contract, right? So, if you actually have some kind of negotiation going on, those onerous terms are going to draw out the time it takes to get to contract, which isn't good. And on the other side, if people are just signing those sorts of things and not reading what's in them, you have to wonder about the quality of the person on the other side. Do they not care simply because they have no ability to pay for the problem if it occurs? So it doesn't matter what they sign. And if you're the owner and you're asking for those terms, it makes you question, what's the expectation here? Do we just intend to put you, the contractor, out of business and then go on, but we still have the fundamental problem of a building not being completed? They both strike me as solutions that don't get you to the end result that you're looking for, which is not to be spending your life in dispute with somebody over a construction project.
Right. And then I don't suppose, in saying I'm going to give you as little latitude as possible, that doesn't exactly lead to a nimble, snappy kind of process. I don't imagine, where there's just a constant fear about signing off on every, there's this tension between being on lockdown, but also being nimble and able to make decisions and react and keep things moving without a whole big feedback loop, I suppose.
Right.
So I presume that's why we have the solutions that we do in modern legal contracts, because neither of those extremes of not worrying or of sewing it up so tight you can hardly move. So what are the things, and I'm thinking specifically about our conversation about balance sheet protection.
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that you can do to protect your balance sheet, and what's kind of rubric for understanding what they're all after and that kind of a thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, in my opinion, and maybe this is a bit flip, but a lot of the risk allocation language, which is what you're talking about, risk allocation of property damage, bodily injury, the things that threaten your balance sheet, what the contract is doing is simply providing a lot of wayfinding for, okay, if this happens, go here for the money. If that happens, go there for the money.
Right.
And what it's often trying to do, perhaps to the displeasure, but paid for, of the insurance companies, is say, what bucket of insurance will this be paid from? And making sure that once it's been paid, it doesn't just continue to lead to future disputes as insurers are trying to recoup their money.
I see. So it's kind of giving you the path of the river down different tributaries, like
Right.
it's a decision tree, and at the end of each decision tree, so to speak, is someone's insurance policy, basically.
Right.
Unless there was a negligible or what's the legal language, unless you were acting in a negligent or malevolent way such that the insurance is also not going to pay for it because
Right.
you have brought this upon yourself knowingly
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I mean, we could spend 2 hours talking about insurance, but let me give you an example with regard to property insurance.
Okay.
So property damage. So one way in which this can occur is that there's a builder's risk policy on the job. It's procured by either the owner or the builder. So builder's risk insurance is basically a fancy name for the property insurance that you carry during construction. Builder's risk insurance.
It's a unique breed of property insurance, basically.
It's a unique breed, and it has, you can scale it to cover different things. So it can cover business interruption. It can cover, to greater or lesser extents, acts of God, the force majeure stuff. So the hurricane, the flooding, the whatever it is that's happening. And you pair that with a waiver of subrogation, which subrogation is just basically, I step into your shoes and then I get to chase whomever it was that you get to chase.
Right.
So if you got to chase the subcontractor, if I'm your insurer and I have the right of subrogation, I get to step in your shoes and then go chase the person that you could have chased. If there's a waiver of subrogation,
then you're saying you can't.
You can't, right. And the value of that is that you're not wasting a lot of time as the contractor or the owner or the subcontractor engaged in dispute resolution when you'd rather be building a building or using the building. It just gets paid. The waiver cuts off the right to chase more, and then you go on your way.
I see. Yeah, and I have seen that more in leases where it's saying, so the owner owns the building and has insurance on the building. The tenant is in the space and they have insurance on the space, but by waiving subrogation, if there's a fire, the owner can't go after the proceeds of the tenant's insurance policy, and the tenant can't go after the proceeds of the owner's insurance policy. They're just you're building a wall between those those means of recouping losses.
And those mutual waivers sometimes are as you describe them, and sometimes they're one way.
Okay.
So I mean that's where you kind of want to have your eyes open and radar up, depending on which side of the equation you're at, because you could be opening yourself up but not have the equivalent right in return.
So one-way waivers of subrogation are terms that one would be advised to avoid if at all possible.
Yes, unless you're a lawyer that likes working on construction disputes.
Right. Um, and it's such a small group, who of people
Yeah.
who love doing that.
Right.
So, okay, so waiver of subrogation, and that's putting you toward the different insurances, which we've covered. Any other kind of main machinery that?
Yeah, so that's property damage to the building itself.
Okay.
You also have property damage to other things. So, and there's an indemnity clause that usually covers this, and it can go both ways. Sometimes it's one way, and it's intended to say, look, I know that we're all in this project together. Like, I'm the owner, it's my building, you're the builder, you're building it. There's subcontractors as well. So when it comes to a problem, it's likely that people can point in different directions. And what we want to make clear is where that actual finger is going to be pointed. And so the indemnity clause says, even though maybe you could say that I had something to do with this, it's going to be your general liability insurance that's going to be protecting both me and you from that third-party claim for property damage or that third-party claim for bodily injury. So these indemnity clauses are intended to do that, and they need to be paired well, and I can unpack what that means, with the insurance provisions, because without the insurance to go with the indemnity, all you've said is you're responsible. You haven't said you're responsible and I know where the money's coming from.
Okay.
That's the importance of the insurance piece.
And in some senses, now am I wanting to make sure that's spelled out, because even though you're going to be the one paying, I have to ensure that you also have the payer lined up so that this doesn't become existential when we have to go that route.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, you want it to be clear to the insurance company so that they say, and usually this is a frequent provision in insurance contracts, the policy, they will respond, but only to the extent it's required by written contract.
Do
So-
insurance companies issue bespoke custom
Yes.
policies for every single contract?
Yeah, they call that manuscripting. So what you'll get are, they'll call it manuscripted endorsements, things that change the standard language in the policy. To back up a little bit, policies come kind of in two different buckets. One are ISO, they call them ISO forms, and they are forms that are generated by a central organization that says, okay, use this, it's got a number on it, and everybody who looks at it is much like AGC or AIA. If you see the number on the bottom, you know what's in it. And then there are other insurance companies that just totally manuscript their policies, and you can never tell what's in them unless you read through the whole thing. And usually the line that these two break down on is that the major insurance players like Zurich or CNA or Hartford, they are using some version of an ISO form that you can understand what it means and grants you from a coverage standpoint.
Which their volume of business dictates they use.
Right. The other set, the sort of lower, more regional tier of insurance companies, are often using whatever it is that they are using on any given day. And those are much harder to digest and understand what you're getting.
Okay.
So if you're an owner, what do you do with what I just said? Well, you at least are taking a look at a certificate of insurance, which is no guarantee of what it is that they have, but you can at least start to understand where they're getting their insurance from. And you can dig down a little in terms of asking for some more information about their policy to see how well it matches up with what's required by contract. So I'll give you an example of that. Often you want to not only have the indemnity provisions which say your insurance protects me, you also want to say I am an additional insured underneath your insurance.
Right.
It's basically two different ways to accomplish the same thing, belt and suspenders.
Right.
So the additional insured endorsement, which gives you that right under the other person's policy, can be written in all sorts of different ways. This bespoke sort of language that you're talking about. That's the piece of paper you want to see. And typically it's not long. It's a couple pages. Take a look at it. It's not long. It'll tell you, are you or aren't you, and to what extent are you?
Yeah. Okay. So to recap this section, the primary thing that these all have in common is they're saying, given scenario X, this person is responsible. The indemnity then says, you're responsible, not me. So like, you're not only have we identified who is responsible, I'm clearly saying I am not that person.
Right.
And we're specifying when we verify that you're the one who's at fault, this is your exit strategy from the problem in the form of a specific insurance policy, which has been written for you either as a standalone or one of these bigger policies. And once we have all that, I am not going to go after the proceeds of your insurance, and you're not going to go after the proceeds of mine.
Right.
This is essentially the solution which has been provided to the issues that can come up with scope, spec, price, schedule issues. Well, that wasn't that hard. So let's talk about now. So let's talk about running through a few different scenarios. Now that we have this know-how on construction contracts, by we I mean I now have it. I know that there are a number of different scenarios when we say construction contract. It could be a garden variety build out. You're a tenant and you have a space that you've leased, and now you're going to build it out with a GC. More common in my experience, or at least what I work on, is where I'm in a development shop and we're going to do a building from scratch. And as a subset of that, you can either be saying we're going to do a building out from scratch and we're going to do it with a general contractor who's then going to further subcontract with people. Or if you're not at all risk averse, you can say, okay, we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to subcontract it directly, in which case I suppose the same principles apply, but it nonetheless looks a bit different. So maybe let's work through briefly that taxonomy. So what percentage of the construction contracts which are floating out there would you say are of this build-out variety? I mean, that must be a huge percentage of the construction contract work that's done. If not in dollars, then nonetheless in quantity, right?
Yeah. So you're talking about build-outs where tenants are saying, okay, I'm going to take some version of a shell up to some scope level, and I'm going to do the rest of the work. Yeah. And
right. I'm going to make this a Starbucks, or I'm going to make it in a bank or something.
Right. All the time, right? A lot of the income-producing property is actually going to be driven that way.
Mm-hmm. And then, so how would you compare and contrast the? Would you say it's more similar, that kind of a contract, to one which is doing the much larger task of a ground-up development, or would you say that they're more dissimilar in that the build-out is a micro subset of what has to happen in a ground-up development?
Yeah, so the contracts are going to be relatively similar, but what you highlight in them will be different. And by that I mean these sort of blocking and tackling issues of scope and schedule and price become more risky when you have two or more different entities performing construction at or near at the same time. So I mean the coordination level has to be pretty good if you're going to have a handoff that works well, and the opportunity for there to be a mistake is much higher. So if you're an owner and you're just building yourself a new whatever it is, and you're responsible for the whole thing, describing scope to your contractor, I mean, you can still have that person who decides not to caulk the bathtubs, but there's a higher expectation of this thing that I'm producing, it needs to be usable as a apartment.
Right.
You
Right.
know that. So if you're leaving holes in this, it's not what I bargained for.
Right.
But on the flip side, if you got somebody who's building just a piece of it, the opportunity to start finger pointing is much greater. And that's where I see a lot of heartburn, just operational heartburn come out of these contracts. And that's where
Operational
these things
heartburn.
get. That's right.
Um,
That's a technical term.
that's right. Um, well, then once you decide though that you are going to, let's say that uh, you're going to do a ground up development and you decide you're on the fence, maybe by some miracle you have the in-house capability to project manage it yourself, and you could go directly to the subs and say, I'm going to enter into a contract with you as a plumber, I'm going to enter into a contract with you as an electrician, with you as a concrete, you as site, whatever. How would you compare and contrast the contracting process between I'm going to a general contractor who's going to bundle all that and do it for me as one company, and so I have one contract, versus I'm going to have 20 or 30 contracts with these different subs? Obviously there's one and there's more, but how would you compare and contrast the legal experience that one will have, both positive and negative, in taking those different routes?
Yeah. I'll try to keep
Assuming
that
you
on.
have the capacity to do that.
Right. Well, let me try to break it down a little bit. So one item that listeners might find interesting is that if you are a tenant in the space and you need to build out your own space, consider using the same architect, the same engineer, and the same GC or set of subcontractors that the developer is using. They're going to know where their work stops and starts, and assuming that they're good characters, you're not going to run into as many problems as somebody who's got to figure that out from
You
scratch.
may get cost efficiencies, or at least they will. I mean, they're already on the site,
Right. And yeah, I mean, there's always that tension of how much can I squeeze out of this project. So if we go to the person who says, well, no, I'm going to do this myself. I think I have the expertise to work with all the different trades, and I'm going to get that done. So here is where coordination becomes sort of key. And there's no, it's not for the weak of heart. You really have to plunge in and make sure you're understanding, and make sure your subcontractors are understanding. So this kind of goes back to project management skills and how good are you at those things. But what I would say, and we'll maybe get to this a little bit later, is that one, uniformity becomes fairly important. So if you're coordinating a plumber and an electrician, you want to make sure that not only are you using the same contract form, but you are using the same template for your scope, your same template for whatever it is.
Right.
The more systematic you can get so that people are working off the same page. And some of it can be fairly non-legal in nature, like, depending on how big or small your project is there a convenient plan for the guy who is just swinging the hammer to look at to know, okay, does the tile stop here or did tile stop here?
Right.
And all the rework that could or couldn't happen as a result of understanding that. I mean, some of these are
reverse engineering where problems could occur and trying to address them.
Yeah, exactly. And you'd be surprised at how basic it can be to start to solve those problems. But it's a full court press when you're doing that stuff. So even if you're doing the direct, the project management work yourself, can you use the same subcontractors that were already on the job? Mm-hmm. That'll help tremendously. Can you make sure that you're using the same architects, that the plans haven't been redrawn and you're getting the same set? Those are some of the things that you can do. Contractually, it's similar stuff, right? You want to increase the incentive for your contractor to figure this stuff out.
Yep.
You might be reluctant to do cost plus. You might want cost plus subject to a GMP or a fixed price saying, look, I don't care how much it takes you. I will only pay you X. And then your scope definition becomes rather important.
Well, in light of this whole need to formalize, I mean, that's really the last thing I wanted to talk about. There is this not cottage industry, skyscraper industry, I suppose, of different contracts out there which exist. So the American Institute of Architects has the most popular. The Association of General Contractors has one. The DBIA, is that the Dubai Builders Institute? Who knows? There's a bunch of different, EJCDC.
Design Builders Institute of America.
And what is EJCDC?
There's your Engineers Joint Committee of. It's fairly close to that.
It's close to eject, which is I'm sure what some people want to do from the project.
I wrote it down. Engineers Joint Contract Documents Committee.
I'm not surprised that engineers are the ones who have the longest name. I've seen on documents EOOPC, Engineers Opinion of Probable Cost. Like, just call it estimate. It's an estimate, Anyway, the good thing about these is that they are standardized. Everybody's seen them. Bad thing is that they're standardized and your job isn't standard. And I remember the first time I saw an AIA contract, I had to look to see what wasn't crossed off. We're not using this page and we're striking out items 19 through 45. And it's kind of the pros and cons of using global amendments. But what has been your experience with the merits and pitfalls of using these standard contracts as opposed to crafting your own bespoke contract from the ground up, so to speak?
Yeah, well, the biggest strength is the one you pointed out, which is people are familiar with them, and it makes it easier to use the same set of terms and conditions for all the different parties. So one thing from a avoidance of dispute or risk allocation is that you want all your documents working the same way. So the owner, the general contractor, to the architect, to the engineer, to the subs, to the suppliers. This is a lawyer's dream that all these documents would be consistent with one another, so that if there's a dispute, there aren't conflicting sets of terms that make it difficult to allocate the risk associated with a problem.
Mm-hmm.
It should be like we had that prior discussion. The wayfinding in a contract tells you where to go to find the bucket of money to pay for the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's easy in one contract, or can be, but in 20 or more, it can start to become complicated. So these forms are intended to at least try to address that problem and make sure that there's some consistency. The problem with these documents is sort of what you talk about. Sometimes people carve them up so much you have no idea. I mean, they might as well be a custom contract because
you're losing the stated benefit of using it if you nullify half of it.
Right. So it doesn't really simplify anything. It doesn't make it easier. It still creates the possibility of conflicting terms. So what do you do then? The other issue with these agreements is that they sometimes delve into details that you wonder why they bother to go into that level of detail. It's somebody sat in a room and did their best to think of
every single thing.
Yeah, and maybe this will apply most of the time, but maybe not to yours. So you have this sort of unintended consequence of the document. And that's where there's just no substitutes. The contract is just like the drawing, just like the spec, another contract document that ought to be understood and reviewed and read. And it's not a Dumbo's feather, kind of like we talked about, but it is relevant and will apply depending on what your situation is. So
it'd be nice. I'm no internet expert, but it would be nice if when you design a web page, very often at the beginning you reference a few different files that it pulls up. One of them is called a CSS reset, and what that does is it kind of zeroes out every conceivable setting because different browsers have very minutely different default settings, and a CSS reset, when you reference it, it loads that whole thing and it basically gets every browser to the same starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all you have to do, and then you kind of go on from there, and you know that you've got consistency in that respect. It would be so nice if you could start a contract by saying, this contract is predicated upon the definitions and recitals of AIA such and such, and then you can move on to your bespoke contract, and it's like, I don't even need to use the AIA. Of course, they want you to use it, but I don't even need to use that. I can go make my bespoke contract, but I'm referencing and undergirding it with an established thing, which I just have to reference. Do you know what I'm saying? That seems like that would be a more elegant solution.
Well, that actually happens right now. So with, like, take any one of these, AIA, we're talking about AIA, they will typically reference in other documents into their main document. So the owner contractor AIA document will bring in the much larger set of terms that are called general conditions.
Yep.
All these forms do that. And they do it, I think, actually, I mean, it's a convenience, right? You're not carrying around this giant thing. You're like, well, it just references that other document and it hasn't been modified. But often I think what it serves to do is avoid showing people what the terms and conditions of their contract are. The business person who is looking at the document that they're going to sign reads it, sees that there's other documents referenced, but doesn't bother to get a copy of it.
Right, which is a liability if you get to look, because it's like, that comes back to that conspicuous question. Was it perfectly clear from this document alone, as a universe unto itself, what this person was saying they're agreeing to? Perhaps not. Now we have a hole in the contract.
Right. So to circle back to our starting conversation about the order of priority, like, what am I getting? You can do this in different ways, but as a lawyer, typically I would be, just like maybe an owner would be, perhaps at a disadvantage about all the different documents that are being brought in. I haven't seen all the specifications. I haven't gone through the giant set of drawings. So I would make sure that the contract superseded all the other stuff. And typically I had no concern about there being a scope problem with that. My concern was some other strange language that some spec writer put into something, or some architect who maybe isn't skilled at legal language put into a drawing, that would have an actual legal consequence beyond what they contemplated. So there are ways of stacking these documents so that you read as far as you need to read to get that particular topic nailed down. Legally, that's probably all the contract documents, but at least you don't have to read through the 500 pages of spec.
Well said. So in the event that all our wordsmithing was for naught, and we somehow, there was a gap, and this goes to the conflict resolution stage, what are the options? Is that spelled out in the contract? Do you have a recommendation? What do you prefer? I know there's different stages of involvement with the legal system. What would you say in terms of righting wrongs when things fall apart?
Yeah. Well, the documents that we talked about, AIA, AGC, DBIA, the engineering set, they all handle dispute resolution following a pretty similar set of protocols. One is direct discussions. So there's some attempt to, let's talk it out. And then it goes to mediation, and then it goes to arbitration or litigation. And both of those are obviously typically going to be binding. Either you go the arbitration route, and in the arbitration route, the benefit there is that you can keep it private. You can select or have some control over who is deciding who's right and who's wrong, meaning you can get somebody who's an industry professional. You can get an architect as an arbitrator. You can get a construction professional as an arbitrator, or a construction attorney, somebody who understands the world that you're playing in, as opposed to, on the litigation side, maybe a jury who isn't.
Okay. It's the question of, do you want the process or the professional, basically? I mean,
Yeah.
there's the
Well,
process better in litigation, but they don't
yeah.
have the background. Whereas here's the professional. But what were you going to say?
Well, somewhat cynically, usually the way I see this is, on the one hand, you have somebody who's going to objectively understand the subject matter better, and that's arbitration. And then on the other hand, you have potentially a group of people who you can enrage, a group of this jury who just says, well, geez, based on the skill of this argument, that contractor or that owner was clearly a bad actor, and therefore just throw the book at them. So, I mean, sometimes that can be a sort of a strategic decision. I think the better option is to go with the arbitration route, mostly because you want people to be pushed to figure stuff out. People become very emotional in disputes, and in my personal experience has been, the more that you can intervene early and not carry around a lot of ego in that dispute resolution process, the better off you're going to be, because disputes fundamentally, or at least often, result from poor communication on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And so people just both sides bring problems to the dispute. And to pretend that one side is clean and the other side isn't is often a sure sign to make sure the other side stays mad at you and convinced that you just don't get it. So the earlier you can have substantive discussions, the better. Here's a tip. Often you'll get experts involved in any kind of dispute. So if there's an engineering problem, there'll be some group of engineers.
There's going to be a witness regardless of the forum.
Having that person engaged early on to help you figure out what the problem is, because often there's a dispute about what exactly is causing this problem and what exactly is the fix. Those two things are really important, because what's causing it tells you which way to go in that contract language, who's at fault, what bucket does it go to, and what does it cost to fix. Often it's very difficult for parties to agree on what the actual appropriate fix is. And that dictates how much it costs. How much does that bucket of money have to pay? If you can get that done early while people are still talking, you can resolve at least a good chunk of your dispute before you go through this loggerhead of arbitration or litigation.
Of course, it would be possible to, in advance, say what the monetary remuneration will be for every scenario that could happen, because you can't possibly forecast them all. But you're just saying, if you begin early in the process of that specific incident,
of the dispute, right? Correct. So this leaning building in San Francisco that you're talking about,
you want to get in at the 1-inch lean, not the 16-inch lean.
Well, right, and surely there is some solution to, righting that building, micro piers or something like this. And we can know parties will have to have their own sort of engagement over, okay, do we agree this is the fix, or does it need to be a bigger, more substantial fix? And then we can price that. And once you know what that number is, it's easier to have a conversation about, okay, how are we going to digest and split all this? If there's a lot of hyperbole in the dispute resolution process, like my damages are astronomical, nobody's going to talk to you. So we didn't talk about this, but there's often a waiver of consequential damages in contracts. Consequential damages are those, I lost all this revenue, or I lost all this.
And you need
earnings.
to quantify up front what it might be, what your monthly revenue will be, so that if it comes to the point where you need to collect 2 months revenue, that's already been decided, and there isn't some big brouhaha over.
Right.
What,
so, I mean,
your rent is how much,
Right. If somebody comes to you and says, give me all your money, or give me all your money, of course you're going to have a fight on your hands, and people just aren't going to find a way of resolving that dispute short of getting through, or pretty darn close to through, the whole dispute resolution process, which is extraordinarily expensive, and money could be used to save your reputation and to to pay for the problem. So, I mean, it's
Their
a difficult
reputations
decision.
seem to often be the very last thing that these people are considering
Yeah.
when the gloves come off.